Daniel Mercer lived two lives, one as a quiet man from Liverpool polishing his bikes in the morning light, and another as lime builder, a digital ghost who moved over £3 million of Class A drugs through an encrypted network in just 8 weeks. When his two worlds finally collided, the illusion of control shattered, revealing how one man's obsession with secrecy built and destroyed an empire hidden in plain sight. Liverpool's quiet neighborhoods have always carried an air of ordinary life, rows of terraced houses, familiar faces, and the hum of distant traffic. It was the kind of place where people nodded politely at each other and kept their business private. On one such street lived Daniel Mercer, a man whose calm, measured presence drew no attention. He appeared like any other hard-working resident, well-kept, polite and unremarkable, but hidden behind his composed exterior was a secret life that would eventually expose one of the most sophisticated drug operations the city had ever seen. Daniel was 34, single, and living alone in a modest house he had inherited from a relative. Neighbors would see him cleaning expensive bikes on weekends, adjusting chains and polishing frames that looked far beyond what most could afford. He changed his cars frequently, never the same one for long, though none of them were flashy enough to raise suspicion. To the outside world, he was a quiet man who enjoyed cycling and kept to himself. But to those operating in the encrypted corners of the criminal world, he was known by another name, a name that inspired both trust and fear: Lime Builder. The double life had begun small. A few years earlier, Daniel had fallen into the lucrative trade of drug distribution after losing his job at a local logistics firm. His understanding of routes, delivery systems, and coded communications gave him an advantage that others didn't have. What started as minor favors for acquaintances quickly evolved into a full-scale business. By the time he switched to encrypted communication platforms, Daniel had already built a reputation for being reliable, efficient, and invisible. Encryption was his shield. Using a specialized device that could self-destruct data if tampered with, Daniel orchestrated his operations through short, coded messages. Every transaction, delivery, and payment was disguised in slang that only his network could interpret: paint tins, holiday boxes, and white sheets. Innocent words that hid the flow of Class A drugs across the country. In just 8 weeks, his system moved over £3 million worth of product without a single face-to-face meeting or recorded phone call. He was careful, almost obsessively so. He paid couriers through untraceable digital transfers and stored profits in cryptocurrencies and assets rather than cash. At home, he lived modestly, but with quiet signs of wealth. Designer watches kept in drawers, limited edition bikes worth thousands, and tailored clothes hidden behind an ordinary wardrobe. His living room contained no photos, no visitors, and no trace of the man he had once been. Daniel's calm exterior masked the constant calculation going on inside his mind. He studied patterns, the routes that avoided police checks, the times of day when couriers could move without risk, and the people he could trust not to talk. Each decision was based on logic, not loyalty. He saw his operation as a business, not a crime. In his mind, he wasn't a drug dealer. He was an entrepreneur who had mastered a market that others were too careless to understand. But no matter how careful he was, small inconsistencies began to emerge. His spending didn't match his supposed lifestyle. Neighbors noticed expensive deliveries arriving at odd hours, and local police had flagged his vehicles more than once. Behind the scenes, analysts from the National Crime Agency were quietly connecting digital clues, tracing suspicious message patterns and delivery routes that all seemed to point toward one area of Liverpool. At first, Daniel dismissed the idea of ever being caught. He believed encryption was unbreakable, his network airtight. Every message was deleted after a few hours, every phone reset after each transaction. But what he didn't know was that law enforcement agencies across Europe were already working to infiltrate the same encrypted platform he trusted. Investigators were developing tools to read the supposedly unreadable, and they were closer than he could ever imagine. As Daniel scrolled through his encrypted messages late one night, confirming yet another high-value deal, He had no idea that his every word had already been captured. His empire, built on silence and secrecy, was about to unravel, not through betrayal or violence, but through the very technology that had once kept him hidden. The encrypted platform Daniel Mercer relied on had become the beating heart of Europe's hidden criminal networks. For months, dealers, traffickers, and smugglers had used it with absolute confidence, believing that every message vanished into digital smoke. The system was designed secrecy. No data stored on servers, no user identified by name, every conversation wrapped in layers of encryption that even experts claimed were impossible to crack. Daniel had chosen it precisely for that reason. As Lime Builder, he operated freely, believing that as long as he stayed within its digital walls, no one could touch him. But in 2020, a secret operation began to dismantle that illusion. Cyber experts working with international law enforcement had found a way in. For months, they monitored the platform silently, capturing every message, every alias, every deal discussed by those who thought they were invisible. Among millions of intercepted texts, a string of coded conversations stood out. They came from a user whose tone was calm, measured, and strangely professional. His username, Lime Builder, appeared again and again in discussions about paint buckets and fresh powder. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that these words were code. The messages painted a picture of someone running a well-oiled distribution system. Lime Builder discussed quantities, prices, and drop locations with precision that sounded almost corporate. He never used names or personal references, but his consistency gave him away. Each order was confirmed with the same symbol, a small green square emoji, sent once a deal was finalized. In one exchange, he mentioned moving 6 tins by Tuesday, final stop L8, a reference that investigators quickly linked to a postcode area in South Liverpool. That clue would prove to be the first crack in his digital armor. The National Crime Agency began working backward, cross-referencing Lime Builder's digital schedule with real-world events. Surveillance teams noticed that on the days matching his messages, specific vehicles appeared at the same drop points described in his code. The number plates led back to short-term rental cars and borrowed vans. A few of those vehicles had previously been linked to low-level offenders who were already under watch for drug-related activities. The connections began to form a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, investigators mapped out Daniel's movements without him ever realizing. They tracked him not by his phone signal, but by the trail of digital coincidences his network produced. Each courier who picked up a parcel, each rental agreement signed under a fake name, every late-night journey along the M62, all of it added invisible threads to a growing web of evidence. The picture became clearer with every passing week. At the same time, Daniel's confidence grew. His operation was moving faster than ever, deals closing daily, profits climbing into the millions. He'd begun upgrading his life. A new watch, a more expensive bike, a sound system he didn't need. To him, success meant invisibility confirmed. If no one questioned his wealth, it meant no one suspected him. What he couldn't see was that the very messages he sent so casually were being read in real time by analysts in an underground digital command center, hundreds of miles away. The day investigators finally connected Lime Builder to Daniel Mercer, it wasn't through a dramatic chase or a hidden camera. It came from something far simpler, a message where Daniel slipped. He referenced a drop near the docks and mentioned that he would cycle down to check the delivery. That tiny phrase, a single word about cycling, aligned perfectly with reports of a man in Liverpool known for his collection of high-end bikes. From there, detectives cross-referenced vehicle sightings, delivery ties, and financial inconsistencies. The puzzle was complete. But they didn't move in right away. They wanted to see how far Daniel's operation reached. Over the next few weeks, they monitored every transaction, recording the full scale of the network. Each message he sent added weight to the growing file against him. By the time law enforcement prepared to strike, they had months of encrypted conversations, transaction records, and a digital paper trail that could survive any courtroom challenge. Daniel, meanwhile, believed he was untouchable. He sat in his living room late at night, phone in hand, watching another deal fall perfectly into place. He smiled to himself, unaware that across the city, officers were already printing out his words, the same words he thought had vanished forever, ready to bring his empire crashing down. It was still dark when the convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled silently through the quiet Liverpool streets. The operation had been planned for weeks, timed to catch Daniel Mercer completely off guard. At 5:42 a.m., officers surrounded his home. A sharp knock, followed by a command to open the door, shattered the calm of the morning. When Daniel finally stepped into the hallway, half awake and disoriented, he was met by a wall of armed officers. Within seconds, he was handcuffed, and the house that had hidden his empire became a crime scene. Inside, the officers began their search. What they found was not the chaos of a typical drug dealer's home. There were no scattered notes, no obvious evidence of crime. Instead, the house was neat, almost obsessively organized. Everything had its place, every surface spotless. But beneath that calm exterior, the signs of unexplained wealth began to surface. In a drawer in the bedroom, they found a collection of luxury watches, Rolex, Omega, and Tag Heuer, neatly arranged in boxes. Each was worth several £1,000s. In the garage, 3 high-end mountain bikes stood lined up, polished and spotless, their combined value approaching the price of a new car. As the search continued, officers noticed smaller details. A smart speaker worth hundreds, designer clothes folded carefully in drawers, and receipts for recent online purchases that totaled more than most people earned in a year. Yet Daniel had no listed employment, no tax records, estimated his profits to exceed £3 million in just 8 weeks. To anyone looking in from the outside, his life had appeared quietly ordinary. But inside those walls, hidden behind layers of encryption and calculation, Daniel Mercer had been running one of the most efficient drug networks in the region, a network that had finally come undone through its own meticulous record-keeping. The days following Daniel Mercer's arrest became a race against time for investigators. They had the man, the ledgers, and fragments of digital evidence. But they needed to uncover the full extent of his operation. What began as a local arrest soon grew into an international investigation stretching far beyond Liverpool. The encrypted messages retrieved from his devices revealed connections to suppliers in London, couriers in Manchester, and contacts using foreign numbers traced to Spain and the Netherlands. Each discovery exposed another layer of a network far larger than anyone had initially imagined. Digital forensics teams worked around the clock. They reconstructed deleted files, pieced together partial message logs, and compared timestamps with vehicle movement data. Slowly, the invisible map of Daniel's empire came into focus. He had built his supply chain like a corporate network, reliable, disciplined, and highly structured. Each courier operated independently, knowing only the details necessary for a single delivery. Payments were handled through cryptocurrency wallets that bounced funds between multiple accounts before vanishing into digital anonymity. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos, but to those studying it, it was clear that every movement had been calculated to avoid detection. Investigators also learned that Daniel had been planning to expand beyond the UK. A series of messages on one of his encrypted accounts referenced new markets and offshore stock. Cross-referencing those communications led to evidence of shell companies registered in Eastern Europe under false identities. One company, supposedly importing bike parts, appeared to be a cover for smuggling drugs hidden within legitimate shipments. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. The man who collected expensive bicycles had used that same passion as camouflage for an international trafficking plan. Even after his arrest, parts of his network continued to operate on autopilot. Couriers who hadn't yet realized their leader was gone carried out deliveries that had been arranged weeks earlier. Surveillance teams intercepted several of these transactions, leading to further arrests and seizures of cash and drugs. Each new arrest added another piece to the puzzle, confirming just how wide Daniel's influence had spread. While the evidence mounted, Daniel remained largely silent during questioning. He gave short, precise answers, never revealing more than required. Detectives believed his silence was not arrogance, but calculation. Without his cooperation, prosecutors would have to rely entirely on the encrypted data and financial records to prove the full scale of his crimes. Yet as the investigation deepened, even his silence began to work against him. The volume of evidence was overwhelming, and every recovered message painted a picture of a man who believed he could outthink the system. Meanwhile, forensic accountants followed the money trail. They uncovered patterns of spending that revealed how Daniel had transformed illicit profits into tangible wealth. High-end bicycles, designer watches, and digital investments were only part of the story. Records showed he had purchased cryptocurrency months before major market spikes, suggesting insider information or deep knowledge of how to manipulate exchange platforms. Some of his digital wallets were traced to anonymous offshore accounts, but others were still active, silently accumulating interest as he sat in a cell. Despite his capture, investigators couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel hadn't worked entirely alone. Several encrypted conversations hinted at a second user who seemed to operate above him, giving instructions and approving deals. This mysterious figure, known only by the alias Grey Flag, never sent direct messages to Daniel but appeared in transaction logs as a shared contact. Analysts speculated that Grey Flag could have been his supplier, or even a partner running the financial side of the operation, but no real-world identity could be matched to the name, and no digital footprint pointed to a specific person. As months passed, the operation's details unfolded in court documents and press releases. To the public, it looked like a clean victory, a sophisticated dealer caught through his own arrogance. But among law enforcement circles, unease lingered. Several encrypted phones seized from other suspects contained fragments of conversations that suggested the network had not fully disappeared. Someone, somewhere, was still using the same coded language, still moving product and still referring to instructions from LB. Whether those messages were echoes of Daniel's old orders or signs of a new operator, no one could be certain. By the time the last courier was arrested, and the final piece of evidence logged, one truth had become clear: Daniel Mercer's downfall had not ended the system he helped build. It had merely exposed how vast and adaptive it truly was. His digital empire had been dismantled, but its blueprint still lingered across servers and encrypted networks. A silent reminder that even in capture, his methods had changed the way organized crime operated. The courtroom was packed on the morning Daniel Mercer was sentenced. Journalists filled the public gallery, their pens ready to capture the story that had fascinated the city for months. The quiet man from Liverpool, once invisible to everyone around him, now stood at the center of one of the country's most intricate drug trafficking cases. Dressed in a plain gray suit, Daniel appeared detached, almost expressionless, as the prosecution laid out the evidence that had taken years to build. He listened without emotion, while his double life was read aloud in precise detail. The prosecution described him as a mastermind who had turned technology into a weapon, running an empire from behind a screen. They presented the coded ledgers found under his floorboards, the designer watches, and the seized drugs as symbols of greed and arrogance. Forensic experts explained how his encrypted messages matched the written codes recovered from his home. Financial investigators traced cryptocurrency movements worth millions, showing how Daniel had hidden his profits through a maze of offshore accounts. Every fragment of his carefully constructed world had been pieced together and laid bare before the court. The defense offered little. They argued that Daniel was not a violent criminal, that he had cooperated during arrest, and that he had shown remorse. But there was no sign of emotion from him. When asked if he wished to say anything before sentencing, he simply shook his head. The judge's words were calm but heavy. He described Daniel's actions as a calculated abuse of technology and trust, noting that the operation's scale was staggering for a single individual. When the sentence was read, 18 years in prison, the room was silent except for the faint scratching of pens on paper. As Daniel was led away, his face remained unreadable. No anger, no regret, only the same distant calm that had carried him through his double life. Those who had investigated him watched from the back of the courtroom. Some felt satisfaction, others unease. For all the evidence they had gathered, there were still gaps, unanswered questions about who Daniel's suppliers truly were, and whether the mysterious figure known as Grey Flag had ever been found. The encrypted data hinted at connections stretching beyond national borders, but many of those threads had vanished into the digital void. After sentencing, investigators conducted one final review of Daniel's seized property. It was meant to be routine, a formality before everything was catalogued and stored. During the process, an officer lifted a section of floorboards in a corner of the living room that had previously gone unnoticed. Beneath it sat a small, locked safe covered in dust. It took several minutes to open, and inside was a single item, a mobile phone wrapped in a cloth. The device was powered off, but on the back was a handwritten label that read, LB2. The discovery stunned the team. It implied that Daniel had operated more than one encrypted identity, and possibly that a second account, one still unseen in the original data leak, might have remained active. Forensics examined the phone, but the encryption was more advanced than any device previously recovered. After weeks of testing, they managed to extract only fragments of messages. What little they recovered suggested that LB2 was communicating with someone using the alias Grey Flag. The timestamps showed that the last message had been sent just 3 days before Daniel's arrest. That revelation reignited fears that someone else had continued the operation while Daniel's world was collapsing around him. In prison, Daniel remained silent about the second phone. He refused all interviews and declined every attempt by investigators to speak with him. His behavior inside was the same as before, calm, isolated, deliberate. He read books, exercised daily, and never discussed his past. Fellow inmates described him as someone who seemed to be waiting for something, as if the outside world still held a plan that hadn't yet finished unfolding. Months later, digital crime units monitoring encrypted networks began noticing familiar patterns. New accounts appeared, using similar phrases and transaction codes to those once used by LimeBuilder. One even referenced a delivery labeled LB2 confirmed. Whether it was coincidence, imitation, or continuation, no one could be sure. But the possibility that Daniel's network had survived in some hidden form refused to fade. The case officially closed with his imprisonment, and the story became another headline in the long battle against organized crime. Yet for investigators, a quiet question lingered. Had they truly dismantled the network, or merely removed one player from a larger game? Somewhere beyond prison walls, the digital world remained alive, encrypted and unseen, waiting for its next ghost to step in and take control.